Hey guys, tonight we begin with a lump of fungus, growing in cow shit, dissolving egos, and somehow convincing humans it was a direct telephone line to God. Which, when you think about it, is exactly the kind of career trajectory you'd expect from something that evolved to confuse insects. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The magic mushroom didn't ask to be magic. It just evolved a defense mechanism so profoundly weird that humans decided to interpret it as spiritual enlightenment. Psilocybin, the compound responsible for the psychedelic experience, exists because fungi needed a way to stop being eaten by insects. The chemical scrambles neurotransmitters, confuses predators, and generally makes consumption an unpleasant experience for anything with a nervous system. Except, of course, for humans. Because humans looked at a mushroom that literally rewires brain chemistry and thought, you know what? Let's build a religion around this. The earliest evidence of human interaction with psilocybin mushrooms dates back somewhere between 9,000 and 11,000 years, which is medieval, for we found some rock art in the Sahara that maybe depicts mushrooms, or maybe depicts umbrellas, but let's call it mushrooms because that's more interesting. The Tassili Naja cave paintings in Algeria show figures holding what appear to be mushroom-shaped objects, surrounded by geometric patterns that look suspiciously like what you'd see if you were, shall we say, experiencing altered states of consciousness. Archaeologists looked at these paintings and said, well, either these people were really into decorative fungi, or they discovered that eating certain mushrooms made the universe look like a kaleidoscope. The smart money is on the latter. But here's where it gets complicated. We can't definitively prove these ancient humans were using psilocybin mushrooms specifically. Could have been Amanita muscaria, the iconic red and white spotted mushroom that contains muscimol and ibotenic acid instead of psilocybin. Different chemistry, different effects, but equally capable of making you question the nature of reality. Could have been both. Could have been neither, and these cave painters were just really committed to abstract expressionism. We'll never know for certain, which drives historians absolutely insane. Truly precious. Adorable. Because we've got 9,000 years of mushroom-related activity, and the written records don't show up until the Spanish conquistadors arrive in Mesoamerica, at which point everyone suddenly remembered to document what the indigenous peoples were doing with fungi. The Aztecs called them Teonanacatl, which translates to flesh of the gods, because apparently when you eat something that dissolves your ego and shows you fractal patterns in the fabric of existence, the appropriate response is to assume you've been snacking on divine protein. The Aztecs weren't messing around with recreational use. This was ceremonial, sacred, deeply embedded in religious practice. Mushrooms were consumed during rituals overseen by priests, used to commune with deities, seek guidance, diagnose illness, and occasionally predict the future. Which, when you think about it, is a pretty reasonable use case. If you're going to hallucinate, might as well get some prophetic wisdom out of it. The Spanish naturally were horrified, because of course they were. The conquistadors arrived in the early 16th century, took one look at indigenous people eating mushrooms and claiming to speak with gods, and immediately classified it as devil worship. The Catholic Church wasn't subtle about this. Teonanacatl became a target of aggressive suppression. Priests documented the practice in exhaustive detail, which is the only reason we know about it at all, while simultaneously working to eradicate it entirely. Call it ethnographic annihilation with footnotes. Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan friar, wrote extensively about Aztec mushroom ceremonies. He described mushroom rituals as intoxicating, visionary, and deeply troubling to Spanish sensibilities. He noted that participants would see visions, receive prophecies, and sometimes weep uncontrollably. The church launched Inquisition-level crackdowns. Mushroom use was banned, practitioners were punished, and the practice was driven underground so thoroughly that by the early 20th century, Western scholars weren't even sure if psilocybin mushrooms had ever been used ceremonially at all. Then, in 1955, R. Gordon Wasson, a New York banker with a side hobby in ethnomycology, travelled to Oaxaca, Mexico. Wasson had read about mushroom ceremonies and decided to investigate whether the tradition still existed. Turns out it did. Maria Sabina, a Mazatec curandera, agreed to let Wasson participate in a velada, a traditional nighttime mushroom ceremony. Wasson ate the mushrooms, experienced what he later described as the most profound moment of his life, and promptly wrote about it in Life magazine in 1957. That article changed everything. Wasson's account introduced the Western world to the concept of psilocybin mushrooms as tools for spiritual exploration. It also, unfortunately, turned Maria Sabina's quiet village into a pilgrimage site for Western seekers looking for enlightenment, which she later said she deeply regretted. Wasson didn't intend to blow up her life, but intent and impact are very different things. The publicity brought anthropologists, hippies, scientists, and thrill seekers flooding into Oaxaca, all demanding their own visionary experiences. Maria Sabina's community suffered for it. She was ostracized by some locals who blamed her for the disruption. She later said that before Wasson arrived, the mushrooms were sacred. After, they became curiosities for outsiders, which is a polite way of saying he turned a religious sacrament into a tourist attraction. But let's rewind a bit, because the history of magic mushrooms doesn't start with the Aztecs. Psilocybin-containing mushrooms grow all over the world. Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas. Psilocybe cubensis, Psilocybe semilanceata, Psilocybe azurescens, dozens of species. They grow in cow pastures, forest floors, decaying wood. They're opportunistic survivors, thriving everywhere. And humans, being humans, have been finding and eating them for millennia. In Europe, there's evidence of mushroom use dating back to the Stone Age. The Selva Pascuala mural in Spain, created around 6,000 years ago, depicts a bull surrounded by mushroom-like shapes. Could be Psilocybe hispanica, could be decorative fungi, could be ancient doodling. We don't know. But mushrooms show up repeatedly in prehistoric European art, which suggests they held some level of cultural significance, whether recreational, spiritual, or purely aesthetic. And then there's the Greek Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most famous religious ceremonies in ancient history, which took place annually for nearly 2,000 years. Participants would travel to Eleusis, undergo a secret initiation, and consume kykeon, a ritual drink that produced intense visions and profound spiritual revelations. Scholars have debated the ingredients of kykeon for centuries. Some argue it contained ergot, a fungus that grows on grains and contains precursors to LSD. Others suggest it might have included psilocybin mushrooms. Still others think it was just barley, water, and mint, and the visions came from prolonged fasting and ritualistic suggestion. The truth is, we'll never know, because the Eleusinian mysteries were, by design, secret. Initiates took oaths never to reveal what they experienced, and they kept that promise so effectively that 2,000 years later, we're still guessing. Which is either incredibly dedicated oath-keeping, or the ancient Greek equivalent of everyone agreeing to never discuss what happened at that party. But here's what we do know. The initiates at Eleusis described their experiences in terms nearly identical to modern accounts of psychedelic trips. They spoke of encountering divine beings, feeling unified with the cosmos, losing all fear of death. Cicero, who was initiated into the mysteries, wrote that the experience was the most important thing he'd ever done. Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, all initiated, all profoundly affected, and none of them left detailed notes. Meanwhile, across the world, indigenous cultures in Central and South America were developing their own relationships with psilocybin mushrooms. The Mazatec people in Oaxaca, the Mixtec in southern Mexico, the Zapotec, the Maya, all incorporated mushrooms into religious and healing practices. These weren't recreational experiences. This was serious spiritual work. Mushrooms were used to diagnose illness, communicate with ancestors, resolve conflicts, and navigate existential crises. Curanderos, the healers who led these ceremonies, trained for years to learn how to guide people through the experience safely. It was a profession, a calling, a responsibility. The Mazatec Velada, the ceremony Maria Sabina practiced, followed a specific structure. It took place at night, in complete darkness. Participants would consume the mushrooms, and the curandera would chant prayers, sing traditional songs, and guide the group through the visions. The mushrooms were treated as sacred beings. entities with agency and intelligence. You didn't just take mushrooms, you asked permission, you showed respect, you approached with humility. The mushrooms, if they deemed you worthy, would show you what you needed to see. If they didn't, well, you'd have a rough night and learn nothing, which is fungal justice at its finest. This worldview, this reverence for the mushrooms as intelligent beings rather than inert substances, is fundamentally different from how Western culture approaches psychedelics. In the West, mushrooms are chemicals. Psilocybin is a compound, a molecule, a substance that binds to serotonin receptors and produces predictable neurological effects. In indigenous Mesoamerican traditions, mushrooms are teachers. They have personalities, preferences, boundaries. You don't control the experience, you surrender to it. You trust the mushrooms to guide you, and if you go in with the wrong intentions, with arrogance or disrespect, the mushrooms will humble you. Fast. This cultural divide became glaringly obvious in the 1960s, when psilocybin mushrooms exploded into mainstream Western consciousness. After Wasson's article in Life magazine, interest in psychedelics skyrocketed. Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, researchers at Harvard, launched the Harvard Psilocybin Project in 1960. They wanted to study the therapeutic potential of psilocybin, its effects on consciousness, its possible applications in psychiatry. Leary, being Leary, also wanted to liberate human consciousness from the shackles of conventional thinking, which is Harvard, for I'm about to get spectacularly fired. The Harvard Psilocybin Project started with good intentions. Leary and Alpert conducted experiments on graduate students, prisoners, and religious figures, documenting the effects of psilocybin in controlled settings. Some of the results were remarkable. The Good Friday experiment, conducted in 1962, gave psilocybin to theology students during a church service, and found that many reported profound mystical experiences indistinguishable from spontaneous religious revelations. Decades later, follow-up studies confirmed that participants still considered it among the most meaningful experiences of their lives. The Concord prison experiment aimed to reduce recidivism by giving inmates psilocybin in therapeutic settings, with initial reports suggesting it worked. Participants described feeling more empathetic, more self-aware, more connected to others. But Leary couldn't leave well enough alone. He started advocating for widespread psychedelic use, not just in clinical settings but in everyday life. Turn on, tune in, drop out became his mantra, which is great for counterculture slogans but terrible for academic credibility. Harvard fired him in 1963. The Psilocybin Project collapsed, and mainstream culture decided that psychedelics were dangerous, subversive, and needed to be banned immediately. In 1970, the United States passed the Controlled Substances Act, classifying psilocybin as a scheduled drug, which is legal terminology for this substance has no medical value, high potential for abuse, and we're making it very illegal to possess, distribute, or research. Most other countries followed suit. Research into psilocybin ground to a halt. The therapeutic potential Leary had championed was buried under decades of stigma and prohibition. And magic mushrooms, which had been used ceremonially for thousands of years, were reclassified as contraband. But here's the thing about fungi. They don't care about laws. Psilocybe cubensis kept growing in pastures. Psilocybe semilanceata kept fruiting in meadows. The mushrooms didn't stop existing just because governments decided they were illegal. People kept finding them, kept eating them, kept having transformative experiences. Underground networks formed. Mushroom cultivation guides circulated. The knowledge didn't disappear. It just went quiet. And in recent years, it's come roaring back. Modern research into psilocybin has exploded, with clinical trials investigating its potential to treat depression, PTSD, addiction, end-of-life anxiety. Johns Hopkins, NYU, Imperial College London, all conducting studies showing that psilocybin, when used in therapeutic settings, produces significant lasting improvements in mental health. We're talking single-session interventions that outperform years of conventional treatment. Depression that's been treatment-resistant for decades lifting after one guided psilocybin experience. Cancer patients losing their fear of death. Addicts breaking free from compulsive behaviours. The results are so compelling that several cities and states in the US have decriminalised psilocybin, and Oregon has legalized it for therapeutic use. The FDA has granted Psilocybin breakthrough therapy designation for treatment-resistant depression. We're witnessing a renaissance, a return to the idea that maybe, just maybe, these mushrooms that humans have been eating for 9,000 years actually do something valuable. Which brings us full circle. The magic mushroom, a fungus that evolved to confuse insects, became a sacrament, became a medicine, became a crime, and is now, slowly, becoming a legitimate therapeutic tool. It didn't change. We did. Our understanding of it shifted. Our laws around it shifted. Our cultural relationship with it shifted. The mushroom just kept doing what it's always done, growing quietly in the dark, waiting for someone curious enough, desperate enough, or brave enough to take a bite. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because to understand how we got from Stone Age cave paintings to clinical trials at Johns Hopkins, we need to understand what psilocybin actually does to the human brain. And the answer is frankly alarming. Psilocybin is a prodrug, which is chemistry for it's not the active compound, it's the thing that becomes the active compound. When you ingest psilocybin, your body converts it to psilocin, and psilocin is what actually crosses the blood-brain barrier and starts wreaking havoc on your neurotransmitters. Specifically, it binds to serotonin receptors, particularly the 5-HT2A receptor, which is involved in mood regulation, perception, and cognition. Psilocin essentially hijacks this receptor, flooding it with signals, and the brain responds by doing something it almost never does. It starts talking to itself in completely new ways. Under normal circumstances, your brain operates on well-worn neural pathways. Thoughts follow predictable patterns. Your sense of self remains stable. Psilocin disrupts all of that. It increases connectivity between brain regions that don't normally communicate. The default mode network, the part responsible for self-referential thinking and maintaining your sense of identity, goes offline. Suddenly, the rigid structure of consciousness becomes fluid. Boundaries dissolve. This is what people mean when they talk about ego death. It's not a metaphor. It's a literal neurological event. The part of your brain that maintains your narrative identity temporarily shuts down. And without that constant internal monologue reinforcing your sense of separateness, you experience yourself as part of everything. The visual hallucinations, the geometric patterns, those are side effects of sensory processing going haywire. Your brain is receiving normal input, but it's interpreting that input through scrambled neural pathways. A blank wall becomes a living mandala, objects breathe. It's not that you're seeing things that aren't there, it's that you're seeing what's there in a completely unfamiliar way. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Is the insight real, or is it just the brain malfunctioning and interpreting that malfunction as profound? The answer, frustratingly, is both. The neurological disruption is real, the altered perception is real, but the insights people gain, the changes in perspective, the emotional breakthroughs, those persist long after the drug wears off. Studies show that months and even years after a single psilocybin session, people report lasting improvements in mood, increased openness, greater sense of meaning in life. You don't get that from a simple malfunction. You get that from an experience that fundamentally shifts how you understand yourself and your place in the world. Western culture, by contrast, approached psychedelics with almost no cultural framework. We had no rituals, no trained guides, no tradition of safe use. We just had Timothy Leary telling college students to dose themselves and see what happens, which predictably led to some spectacular disasters. People took mushrooms at parties, in chaotic environments, with no preparation or support. They had terrifying experiences, bad trips, psychological crises, and instead of recognizing that the problem was context, we decided the problem was the substance itself. But the indigenous traditions knew better. The setting matters, the intention matters, the guidance matters. You don't just eat mushrooms and hope for the best. You prepare. You create a safe space. You approach with respect. You have someone experienced there to help you navigate the difficult moments, because there will be difficult moments. Ego death isn't comfortable. Confronting repressed trauma isn't pleasant. Dissolving your sense of self can be terrifying, but with the right support, with the right framework, those difficult moments become opportunities for growth. And the mechanism appears to be exactly what the indigenous healers always said it was. The mushrooms don't fix you. They show you how to fix yourself. They create a window of neuroplasticity, a temporary state where the brain becomes unusually receptive to change. Old patterns break down, new connections form, and in that liminal space, with the right support, people can rewrite their relationship with themselves, with their emotions, with their lives. To understand why magic mushrooms became so widespread across human cultures, you need to understand just how good they are at existing. Psilocybin mushrooms aren't rare tropical specimens. They're opportunistic colonizers that thrive everywhere. Cow pastures, decaying wood, forest debris, golf courses, suburban lawns. If there's organic matter and moisture, there's a decent chance psilocybin mushrooms are nearby, fruiting quietly, waiting for someone to notice. Psilocybe cubensis, probably the most famous species, grows throughout subtropical and tropical regions worldwide. Central and South America, Southeast Asia, Australia, the southern United States, anywhere warm and humid. It has a particular fondness for cow dung, which is both practical and deeply undignified. Here's this mushroom that humans have used for thousands of years to commune with the divine, and it's literally growing out of cattle excrement. Evolution doesn't care about spiritual aesthetics. The relationship between psilocybin mushrooms and cattle is fascinating. Psilocybe cubensis doesn't parasitize the cows. It decomposes what they leave behind. The cows eat grass, digest it poorly, and excrete partially processed plant material. The mushrooms colonize that material, fruit, release spores, and continue the cycle. The cows don't notice. The mushrooms thrive, and humans show up periodically to harvest the fungi and have mystical experiences. It's a surprisingly functional ecological arrangement. Psilocybe semilanceata, commonly called liberty caps, takes a different approach. It grows in temperate grasslands across Europe, particularly in the British Isles, fruiting in autumn. Unlike cubensis, semilanceata doesn't grow directly on dung. It colonizes grassroots and decaying plant material. The mushrooms are small, with distinctive conical caps, and they're potent. Weight for weight, semilanceata contains more psilocybin than cubensis, which means that for centuries, British mushroom hunters have been combing through sheep pastures in the rain, collecting tiny fungi that look like they could blow away in a strong wind, all to access compounds that temporarily dissolve consciousness. Psilocybe azurescens, native to the Pacific Northwest coast, is even more potent. It's one of the strongest naturally occurring psilocybin mushrooms. Azurescens grows on decomposing wood, particularly in coastal dune grasses. It bruises blue when handled, a characteristic common to many psilocybin species caused by oxidation of psilocin. That blue bruising became a field identification marker. If you pick a mushroom and it turns blue where you touched it, there's a good chance it contains psilocybin. But identification isn't simple. There are over 200 species of psilocybin-containing mushrooms, and they don't all look alike. Some have conical caps, some have flat caps, some grow on wood, some grow on dung, and crucially, some non-psychoactive mushrooms look very similar to psychoactive ones, which means that throughout history, people have occasionally eaten the wrong mushroom and died. Amanita phalloides, the death cap, looks innocent. Small, unremarkable, grows in similar environments. It also destroys your liver. There's no antidote. You eat it, you wait while your organs fail, then you die. Which is why indigenous cultures developed extremely precise knowledge of species identification, seasonal fruiting patterns, and safe harvesting practices. They couldn't afford mistakes. The global distribution of psilocybin mushrooms meant that cultures worldwide independently discovered their effects. There's no evidence of a single origin point. Instead, people everywhere stumbled onto the fact that certain mushrooms alter consciousness, and each culture developed its own relationship with them. In Mesoamerica, mushrooms became integral to religious ceremonies. In Europe, they were used sporadically, often associated with folk magic. In parts of Africa and Asia, evidence suggests mushroom use existed but remained localized. The Mazatec people in Oaxaca developed one of the most sophisticated mushroom traditions. They didn't just eat mushrooms and wait for visions. They created elaborate rituals that lasted all night, conducted by highly trained healers who spent years learning the prayers, songs, and techniques needed to guide people safely. The curanderos understood something Western culture is only now rediscovering. Set and setting matter. The environment, the intention, the presence of skilled guides, these factors shape the experience as much as the chemical itself. A typical Mazatec velada began after sunset. Participants gathered in a darkened room. The curandera would chant prayers in Mazatec, invoking ancestors and sacred beings. She would prepare the mushrooms, always treated with reverence. The mushrooms were distributed, consumed in darkness, and then the real work began. Hours of chanting, singing, praying. The curandera's voice became the anchor, the thread that kept participants tethered as they navigated the dissolution of ordinary consciousness. People would see visions, not just visual hallucinations, but profound psychological revelations. They would confront fears, process trauma, receive guidance. The mushrooms, in Mazatec understanding, were intelligent beings. They could see into your heart, understand your needs, and provide what was necessary, even if deeply uncomfortable. The curandera's job was to create the container for that work, to hold the space, to sing the songs that helped people integrate what they were experiencing. This is radically different from how psychedelics entered Western culture in the 1960s. They arrived without cultural framework, no trained guides, no sacred context, no understanding that the experience required preparation, intention, and integration. People just took mushrooms at parties, in dorm rooms, at music festivals. Sometimes it went well, often it didn't, and mainstream culture didn't have tools to understand what had happened. We just labelled it a bad trip and moved on. But indigenous traditions understood that there's no such thing as a bad trip. There are difficult experiences, challenging journeys, confrontations with uncomfortable truths. But those experiences, when held properly, when integrated with support, become opportunities for healing. The mushrooms don't give you what you want. They give you what you need. And sometimes what you need is to confront the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. Maria Sabina spent decades working with mushrooms before Wasson arrived. She learned the practice from her family, studied with other curanderos, developed her own relationship with the mushrooms over years of ceremonial use. She didn't consider herself the source of healing. The mushrooms were. She was simply the guide, the translator, the person who created conditions for the mushrooms to do their work. When Wasson published his Life magazine article, he described the experience with enthusiasm and reverence. He talked about profound mystical insights, unity with existence, dissolution of boundaries. He genuinely believed he was sharing something important, introducing Western culture to a spiritual technology that could transform consciousness. And he was. But he also fundamentally misunderstood the context. He treated the mushrooms as a substance, a chemical you could extract and use outside its cultural container. He didn't grasp that the ritual, the songs, the presence of the curandera, the darkness, the prayers, all of that was as essential as the mushrooms themselves. The result was predictable. Western seekers flooded into Oaxaca, demanding mushroom ceremonies without understanding or respecting the tradition. Some curanderos obliged, out of financial need or genuine desire to share their knowledge. Others refused, recognizing that what was being asked for wasn't the sacred work they practiced, but tourism. Maria Sabina found herself in an impossible position. She'd opened a door she couldn't close. Her village became a destination. People showed up expecting instant enlightenment, treating the mushrooms like a drug rather than a sacrament. The tradition she'd devoted her life to was being commodified in real time. She later expressed deep regret about Wasson's visit, not because she didn't want to share the mushrooms, but because the context was lost in translation. The mushrooms were meant to heal, to guide, to teach. But without proper framework, without the songs and prayers and trained guidance, they became something else, a recreational substance, a means to an exotic experience. The sacred became profane through sheer volume of misunderstanding. This pattern has repeated throughout the history of psychedelics in the West. We discover a substance used ceremonially by indigenous cultures. We strip away the context, isolate the chemical, and try to use it on our terms. Sometimes it works, often it causes harm, and then we're surprised when results are inconsistent, when some people have profound healing and others have psychological crises. We forget that these substances aren't neutral, they're tools, and like any tool, they require skill, knowledge, and respect to use effectively. The other major mushroom that shaped human history is Amanita muscaria, the iconic red-capped mushroom with white spots that shows up in fairy tales and psychedelic art. Except Amanita muscaria doesn't contain psilocybin. It contains muscimol and ibotenic acid, completely different compounds with completely different effects. Muscimol is a GABA agonist, which means it affects the brain's inhibitory neurotransmitter system rather than serotonin receptors. The experience is less visual, more sedative, often described as dreamlike rather than reality-shattering. But Amanita muscaria has its own rich history of human use. There's evidence suggesting it was used in Siberian shamanic practices, where shamans would consume the mushrooms, enter trance states, and perform healing rituals. The mushrooms were rare and valuable, and here's where it gets weird. Muscimol passes through the human body largely unchanged, which means that after a shaman consumed the mushrooms, their urine still contained active compounds. And yes, people would drink that urine to experience the effects themselves. The mushroom was expensive. The metabolites were free. Waste not, want not. Some scholars suggest that Amanita muscaria might be the mysterious soma described in the ancient Hindu Rig Veda, a sacred drink that granted divine visions. The Vedic text describes soma as a plant that was crushed, filtered, and consumed, producing profound spiritual experiences. The descriptions are vague enough that soma could have been any number of substances, but Amanita muscaria fits several criteria. It grows in the regions where Vedic culture developed. It produces altered states, and the texts describe filtering the soma, which could reference removing toxic compounds through preparation. Of course, we'll never know for certain what soma actually was. The knowledge was lost thousands of years ago, which means we're left with tantalizing hints and no definitive answers. Call it the recurring theme of ancient psychedelic history. What we do know is that throughout human history, whenever people encountered consciousness-altering mushrooms, they treated them as significant. Not always sacred, not always ceremonial, but never casual. These weren't recreational drugs in the modern sense. They were tools for specific purposes: healing, divination, communication with the divine, navigation of psychological crises. The mushrooms were respected, sometimes feared, always approached with intention. And then the 20th century happened, and everything changed. The Harvard Psilocybin project, despite its flaws and Leary's eventual self-destruction, did produce some legitimate scientific insights. The Good Friday experiment, for all its methodological issues, demonstrated that psilocybin could reliably produce mystical experiences that participants found meaningful and lasting. The prison experiments, though their results were later questioned, suggested that psychedelics might have therapeutic applications in treating addiction and recidivism. But the broader cultural context was chaos. Leary's turn-on, tune-in, drop-out message resonated with the counterculture movement, but horrified mainstream America. Young people were taking LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, often in uncontrolled settings, often with no preparation or guidance. Some had transformative experiences, others had psychological breaks. The media reported on the bad trips, the hospital visits, the occasional tragic outcome. And mainstream culture, already deeply uncomfortable with the counterculture's rejection of traditional values, decided that psychedelics were the problem. The war on drugs, launched by Nixon in 1971, wasn't really about drugs. It was about control, about suppressing dissent, about criminalizing the counterculture and anti-war movements. Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, later admitted as much. The administration couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or to be part of the counterculture, but they could criminalize drugs associated with those movements. They could raid homes, break up communities, imprison activists, all under the guise of drug enforcement. Psilocybin mushrooms, along with LSD, cannabis, and other psychedelics, became Schedule I controlled substances. Research permits became nearly impossible to obtain. Clinical trials stopped. Universities abandoned psychedelic research. The therapeutic applications that researchers had barely begun to explore were buried under decades of prohibition, and an entire generation of potential scientific insights was lost. But here's what didn't stop. People didn't stop finding mushrooms. They didn't stop growing them. They didn't stop eating them. The prohibition drove the practice underground, but it didn't eliminate it. If anything, it made the knowledge more precious. Mushroom cultivation guides circulated through underground networks. Spore vendors operated in legal grey areas, selling spores for microscopy research with a wink and a nod. People learned to identify wild mushrooms, to fruit them in makeshift grow operations, to preserve them for later use. The mushrooms themselves, of course, were utterly indifferent to human laws. Psilocybe cubensis didn't stop growing in pastures because Congress said it was illegal. Psilocybe semilanceata didn't check British drug policy before fruiting in meadows. The fungi just kept doing what they'd always done, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to harvest them despite the legal consequences. And slowly, quietly, knowledge accumulated. Not in universities or research institutions, but in underground communities. People who used mushrooms therapeutically, who guided each other through difficult experiences, who developed their own frameworks for safe use. The traditions that Maria Sabina practiced didn't disappear. They evolved, adapted, merged with Western psychological concepts. People created their own rituals, their own preparation practices, their own integration methods. By the 1990s, enough time had passed that a few brave researchers started pushing for renewed psychedelic research. The cultural panic had subsided. The war on drugs was clearly failing, and there were compelling reasons to revisit these substances from a scientific perspective. Depression rates were climbing. PTSD from wars in Iraq and Afghanistan was overwhelming the VA healthcare system. Addiction treatment had abysmal success rates. Traditional psychiatric medications helped some people, but left many others suffering. The first modern psilocybin study at a major research institution happened at Johns Hopkins in 2000. Roland Griffiths, a psychopharmacologist who'd spent his career studying addiction and drug abuse, decided to investigate whether psilocybin could produce genuine mystical experiences in controlled settings. The study was methodologically rigorous, with careful screening, trained guides, and long-term follow-up. The results, published in 2006, were remarkable. 2/3 of participants rated their psilocybin session as among the 5 most meaningful experiences of their lives. 1/3 rated it as the single most meaningful experience. 14 months later, those ratings remained stable. That study cracked open the door. Other researchers took notice. Funding, previously impossible to obtain for psychedelic research, started trickling in. More studies followed. Psilocybin for depression. Psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety in cancer patients. Psilocybin for treatment-resistant PTSD. Psilocybin for addiction to cigarettes, to alcohol, to other substances, and consistently, across multiple studies, multiple research institutions, multiple countries, the results showed the same thing. Psilocybin works. Not perfectly, not for everyone, not as a magic cure, but as a tool, when used properly, with preparation and integration and skilled therapeutic support, psilocybin produces outcomes that rival or exceed the best conventional treatments. Single sessions producing remission in depression that hadn't responded to years of medication and therapy. Cancer patients losing their fear of death and spending their final months in peace. Alcoholics achieving sobriety rates twice as high as conventional treatment. Smokers quitting after decades of failed attempts. The mechanism appears to be what indigenous healers always said it was, just translated into neuroscience terminology. The mushrooms create a window of neuroplasticity. They temporarily disrupt rigid patterns of thinking and perception. They allow people to see themselves and their lives from completely new perspectives. And in that liminal space, with skilled guidance, people can rewrite deeply ingrained patterns, can break free from destructive cycles, can fundamentally shift their relationship with themselves and their suffering. Which brings us to where we are now. Psilocybin is still federally illegal in the United States, still classified as Schedule 1 with no accepted medical use. But that classification is increasingly absurd in the face of mounting scientific evidence. Oregon has legalized psilocybin for therapeutic use. Cities like Denver, Oakland, and Washington, D.C. have decriminalized it. Clinical trials are ongoing at major research institutions worldwide. The FDA has granted psilocybin breakthrough therapy designation, which is regulatory language for this looks promising enough that we're going to expedite the approval process. The mushroom, which started as a fungal defense mechanism, which became the flesh of the gods in Aztec ceremony, which became contraband in the war on drugs, is now on track to become FDA-approved medicine. Full Circle doesn't quite capture it. The prohibition drove the practice underground, but it didn't eliminate it. If anything, it made the knowledge more precious. Mushroom cultivation guides circulated through underground networks. Spore vendors operated in legal grey areas. People learned to identify wild mushrooms, to fruit them in makeshift grow operations, to preserve them for later use. The mushrooms themselves were utterly indifferent to human laws. Psilocybin cubensis didn't stop growing in pastures because Congress said it was illegal. The fungi just kept doing what they'd always done, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to harvest them despite the legal consequences. And slowly, quietly, knowledge accumulated. Not in universities or research institutions, but in underground communities. People who used mushrooms therapeutically, who guided each other through difficult experiences, who developed their own frameworks for safe use. The traditions that Maria Sabina practiced didn't disappear. They evolved, adapted, merged with Western psychological concepts. People created their own rituals, their own preparation practices, their own integration methods. The underground cultivation scene that emerged in the 1970s and 1980s was remarkably sophisticated. Hobbyists developed techniques for growing psilocybin mushrooms indoors, creating sterile environments, producing reliable yields. They shared knowledge through mail-order pamphlets, word of mouth, and eventually through early internet forums. The information flowed despite legal risks. Because when you criminalize knowledge, you don't eliminate it. You just make it more valuable to those who possess it. One of the most influential figures in mushroom cultivation was Terence McKenna, an ethnobotanist, psychedelic advocate, and relentless promoter of mushroom use. McKenna, along with his brother Dennis, published Psilocybin, Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide in 1976 under pseudonyms. The book provided detailed instructions for cultivating Psilocybin cubensis at home using simple, accessible materials. It democratized mushroom cultivation, making it possible for anyone with basic equipment and patience to grow their own supply. McKenna's approach was part practical guide, part philosophical manifesto. He argued that psilocybin mushrooms were tools for expanding consciousness, for accessing modes of perception unavailable through ordinary awareness. He spoke about mushrooms in almost mystical terms, suggesting they might be alien intelligence, that they communicated with humans through the psychedelic experience, that they were trying to teach us something essential about the nature of reality, which was either profound insight or spectacularly creative interpretation, depending on your perspective. But McKenna's enthusiasm, however eccentric, helped keep mushroom knowledge alive during the darkest years of Prohibition. His lectures, his books, his tireless advocacy created a cultural space where people could discuss psychedelics seriously, could consider them as tools rather than threats. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't conducting controlled studies, but he was preserving and spreading knowledge that the official institutions had abandoned. The psilocybin sessions at Johns Hopkins, at Imperial College London, at other research institutions, they don't just give people a pill and send them home. The preparation is extensive. Participants meet with trained therapists multiple times before the session. They discuss their intentions, their fears, what they hope to gain from the experience. They learn what to expect, how to navigate difficult moments, when to surrender rather than resist. The session itself takes place in a comfortable room designed to feel safe and supportive. Soft lighting, calming music, comfortable furniture. 2 trained guides are present throughout. The participant lies down, wears an eye mask to facilitate inward focus, and is encouraged to let go, to trust the process, to follow wherever the experience leads. The guides don't direct the experience. They hold the space, provide reassurance during difficult moments, help the participant stay grounded. And afterward, the integration work begins. Multiple therapy sessions focused on processing what happened, translating the insights gained into practical changes, making sense of the experience. Because the psilocybin session isn't the treatment, it's the catalyst. The real work happens in the weeks and months that follow, as people incorporate the new perspectives, the emotional breakthroughs, the shifts in self-understanding into their daily lives. This careful, intentional approach produces results that casual recreational use rarely achieves. It's the difference between taking mushrooms at a party and undergoing a therapeutic journey with skilled support. Both involve the same chemical. Both alter consciousness. But the outcomes are dramatically different. Which brings us back to the indigenous traditions that understood this all along. The Mazatec Velada wasn't just about eating mushrooms. It was about creating a sacred container for transformation. The songs, the prayers, the presence of the curandera, the darkness, the hours of guided journey, all of that was essential. Maria Sabina didn't hand people mushrooms and say good luck. She guided them through one of the most psychologically vulnerable experiences a human can have, with skill developed over decades of practice. And Western culture, in its initial encounters with psychedelics, ignored all of that. We wanted the chemical. We wanted the altered state. We didn't want the ritual, the preparation, the integration. We treated psychedelics like a recreational drug, like alcohol or cannabis, something you could just consume for a few hours of altered perception. And when that approach produced inconsistent and sometimes harmful results, we blamed the substance rather than recognizing our own ignorance. The modern psychedelic renaissance, to its credit, is taking the indigenous wisdom seriously. Clinical researchers aren't just studying psilocybin as a chemical, they're studying the entire therapeutic framework, the preparation, the setting, the guidance, the integration. They're acknowledging that context matters as much as pharmacology. They're building on thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, even if they're translating it into the language of neuroscience and clinical psychology. But there's still tension, because the people who preserved this knowledge through centuries of suppression aren't the ones profiting from the psychedelic renaissance. Indigenous communities in Oaxaca aren't receiving royalties from pharmaceutical companies developing psilocybin-based medications. Maria Sabina's descendants aren't consulted by startups offering luxury mushroom retreats. The knowledge was extracted, commodified, and is now being sold back to the world as innovation. This isn't unique to psychedelics. It's the pattern of colonial extraction playing out again. Indigenous knowledge is dismissed as primitive superstition until Western science validates it, at which point it becomes intellectual property. The people who maintain the traditions get acknowledgement, maybe, if they're lucky. The people who commercialize it get wealth. The irony would be funny if it weren't so predictable, and the commercialization is moving fast. Startups are racing to develop patentable forms of psilocybin. Clinics are opening in states and countries where therapeutic use is legal, charging thousands of dollars per session. Retreat centers are marketing luxury experiences, complete with gourmet meals and spa treatments, where you can have your consciousness expanded in comfort. The substance that grew in cow shit, that indigenous healers offered as sacred, medicine, is being repackaged as premium wellness. Some of this commercialization is necessary. Clinical research requires funding. Therapeutic services require trained professionals and appropriate facilities. There are real costs involved in providing safe, effective psilocybin-assisted therapy. But there's a difference between sustainable business models and luxury brand positioning. There's a difference between making these services accessible and marketing them as exclusive experiences for wealthy clients. The debate over access is ongoing and contentious. Should psilocybin therapy be covered by insurance? Should there be community-based models that make treatment available regardless of ability to pay? Who gets to decide who can access these substances? The FDA approval process will help with insurance coverage, but it will also cement certain frameworks, certain business models, certain power structures. Once psilocybin becomes an FDA-approved medication, the pharmaceutical companies that funded the trials will have significant control over how it's distributed and at what cost. Meanwhile, decriminalization efforts are creating a different path. Cities and states that have decriminalized psilocybin aren't necessarily creating regulated therapeutic frameworks. They're simply removing criminal penalties for possession and use, which means people can grow their own mushrooms, can use them privately, can create community-based support networks without fear of prosecution. It's a more grassroots approach, closer to how mushrooms have been used historically. Oregon's model is somewhere in between. They've created a licensed facilitator system where trained guides can provide psilocybin sessions in approved facilities. It's not medical, it's not recreational, it's something new, a recognition that psilocybin doesn't fit neatly into existing regulatory categories. The facilitators aren't required to be medical professionals, which opens the door for people with traditional knowledge, with indigenous training, with years of underground experience to be part of the legal framework. But even Oregon's system has issues. The licensing requirements, the facility requirements, the regulatory oversight, all of that costs money. Which means that even in a decriminalised therapeutic framework, access is likely to favour those with resources. The equity questions remain unresolved. How do you make something accessible when the legal framework itself creates barriers to access? And then there's the question of what happens when psilocybin becomes mainstream. Right now, mushroom cultivation is still somewhat niche. Growing your own requires knowledge, patience, sterile technique. Most people who use psilocybin either find it through underground networks or, in places where it's legal, access it through facilitators or retreat centres. But what happens when psilocybin-assisted therapy is widely available? When your doctor can prescribe it? When it's covered by insurance? Do we see a cultural shift in how people understand consciousness, mental health, the nature of self? Do we see reduced rates of depression, addiction, existential anxiety? Or do we see the same commodification and medicalization that happened with cannabis, where a plant with thousands of years of traditional use becomes just another product, stripped of cultural context, marketed for profit? The optimistic view is that widespread access to psilocybin therapy could genuinely transform mental health care. Depression, PTSD, addiction, these are massive public health problems with limited effective treatments. If psilocybin can help even a fraction of the people who are currently suffering, that's millions of lives improved. The potential is real. The clinical results are compelling. The neurological mechanisms make sense. The pessimistic view is that we're about to watch psychedelics get absorbed into the same broken healthcare system that created the mental health crisis in the first place. That psilocybin will become another pharmaceutical product, another billable service, another way for people with resources to access treatment while those without resources continue to suffer. That the indigenous knowledge, the underground wisdom, the community-based frameworks will be displaced by clinical protocols and insurance codes. The realistic view is probably somewhere in between. Psilocybin therapy will help some people dramatically. It will help others moderately. It won't help everyone. Access will improve but remain uneven. The commercialization will be uncomfortable but perhaps necessary. The indigenous communities who preserve this knowledge will receive some acknowledgement but inadequate compensation. And the mushrooms themselves, growing quietly in pastures and forests, will continue doing what they've always done, utterly indifferent to human systems of power and profit. Because that's the thing about psilocybin mushrooms. They existed long before humans noticed them. They'll exist long after we're gone. They're not ours to own, to control, to commodify. They're ecological entities with their own evolutionary trajectory. We just happen to discover that when we eat them, something profound and strange happens to our consciousness. And we've been trying to make sense of that ever since. The history of magic mushrooms is really the history of humans encountering something that fundamentally challenges our understanding of consciousness, reality, and the boundaries of self. Every culture that discovered psilocybin had to grapple with the same questions. What does it mean that a fungus can dissolve your ego? What does it mean that a chemical can produce experiences indistinguishable from spontaneous mystical revelation? What does it mean that something you can find growing in a cow pasture can temporarily rewrite your relationship with yourself, with others, with existence itself? These aren't questions we've answered. They're questions we keep asking in different languages through different frameworks. The Aztecs asked them and called the mushrooms Teonanacatl, flesh of the gods. The Mazatec asked them and built elaborate ceremonies around safe, sacred use. Western neuroscience asks them and maps changes in default mode network activity. But we're all circling the same mystery. What is consciousness? What is the self? And what does it mean that these boundaries, which feel so solid, so permanent, can be temporarily dissolved by a fungal compound? Maybe there isn't an answer. Maybe the mystery is the point. Maybe psilocybin mushrooms are valuable precisely because they resist easy explanation, because they force us to confront the limits of our understanding, because they remind us that consciousness is stranger and more fluid than we usually acknowledge. They're not a cure. They're not a solution. They're a tool for asking better questions. The clinical research into psilocybin over the past 2 decades has produced results that would have seemed impossibly optimistic during the Prohibition years. Not just positive results, transformative results. Take the Johns Hopkins study on smoking cessation. Cigarette addiction is notoriously difficult to treat. The best conventional methods produce long-term quit rates around 30%. The Johns Hopkins study gave participants psilocybin with cognitive behavioral therapy. The long-term abstinence rate was 67%. After a single psilocybin session, 2/3 of participants quit smoking and stayed quit for over a year. The mechanism isn't mysterious. Addiction isn't just physical dependence. It's a pattern of behavior, a relationship with a substance. People smoke because they're anxious, bored, or because it's part of their identity. Psilocybin disrupts all of that. It dissolves the patterns, breaks the associations, temporarily removes the narrative around being a smoker. And in that space, with therapeutic support, people can rebuild their relationship with themselves without the addiction. The depression studies show similar outcomes. Treatment-resistant depression affects millions of people. Standard antidepressants work for maybe 40% of patients. Psilocybin-assisted therapy produces remission rates of 50 to 70% in treatment-resistant cases. People who've been depressed for decades suddenly experience lasting relief after 1 or 2 guided sessions. The neuroscience helps explain why. Depression isn't just sadness. It's a pattern of rigid, negative thinking that becomes self-reinforcing. The brain develops neural pathways that default to pessimism, hopelessness. Every thought reinforces those pathways. It's not a choice. It's a neurological groove that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. Psilocybin temporarily disrupts those pathways. It increases neuroplasticity. The rigid patterns break down. New connections form. And with skilled therapeutic support, people can develop new patterns, new ways of relating to themselves. The depression doesn't just lift. The underlying cognitive structures get rewritten. But here's the critical part. The psilocybin session isn't magic. It's not a reset button. It's a catalyst that makes change possible. The real work happens in the therapy sessions, the preparation, the integration, where people translate insights into practical changes. Without that therapeutic framework, the psilocybin session is just a trip. Profound, maybe, but not necessarily therapeutic. This is why the indigenous traditions emphasize ceremony, guidance, integration. They understood intuitively what neuroscience is now confirming. The chemical alone isn't enough. The context matters. The intention matters. The support matters. You can't just take mushrooms and expect transformation. You have to do the work. The mushrooms open the door. You have to walk through it. The end-of-life anxiety studies are perhaps the most emotionally striking. Cancer patients facing terminal diagnoses often experience profound existential distress. Fear of death, fear of suffering, fear of leaving loved ones behind. Conventional treatments, anxiolytics and therapy provide some relief but rarely address the fundamental terror of mortality. A single psilocybin session, in multiple studies, has produced lasting reductions in death anxiety. Patients report feeling at peace with their mortality, experiencing a sense of connection to something larger than themselves, losing the fear that had been dominating their final months. The descriptions of these experiences are remarkably consistent. Patients talk about feeling their ego dissolve, experiencing themselves as part of a larger whole, understanding death not as annihilation but as transformation. They describe encounters with deceased loved ones, visions of light and beauty, profound feelings of love and acceptance. Some interpret these experiences religiously, others interpret them psychologically. But the outcome is the same. They stop being terrified of dying. They spend their remaining time focusing on connection, on meaning, on what matters, rather than on fear. Is the mystical experience real, or is it the brain producing comforting hallucinations in response to existential threat? Honestly, who cares? The outcome is what matters. These people are dying. If a psilocybin session gives them peace, if it allows them to approach death with equanimity rather than terror, that's valuable regardless of the ontological status of their visions. The mushrooms aren't proving the existence of an afterlife. They're providing a framework for confronting mortality with dignity. The PTSD research is still early but promising. Trauma embeds itself in the brain as intensely vivid memories that trigger overwhelming emotional responses. Veterans with PTSD can't think about their combat experiences without reliving the terror, the helplessness, the horror. Survivors of abuse can't access those memories without being flooded by the emotions they felt during the trauma. The memories remain unprocessed, unintegrated, locked in a state of perpetual activation. Psilocybin appears to create a window where traumatic memories can be accessed without triggering the full emotional response. The default mode network goes offline. The rigid boundaries around the traumatic memory soften, and with skilled therapeutic guidance, people can process the trauma, can integrate it into their life narrative without being overwhelmed by it. The memory doesn't disappear, but it loses its power to control, to terrorize, to dominate. Early results suggest remission rates comparable to MDMA-assisted therapy, which has shown remarkable effectiveness for PTSD. Small changes in molecular structure can produce dramatically different effects. It's possible that the exact properties that make psilocybin therapeutic are also the properties that pharmaceutical companies are trying to modify. Ego dissolution might be uncomfortable, but it might also be necessary for therapeutic outcomes. Visual hallucinations might be distracting, but they might be part of the process that makes the experience meaningful. The risk is that in trying to make psilocybin more palatable, more convenient, more pharmaceutical, we lose what makes it effective, that we create substances that are easier to use but less transformative, that we optimize for comfort rather than healing. The indigenous traditions never tried to make mushrooms comfortable. They understood that transformation requires discomfort, that growth happens through challenge, that sometimes you have to be willing to experience things that are difficult in order to change. This tension between convenience and transformation is likely to define the next phase of psychedelic medicine. Do we want substances that gently nudge people toward better mental health? Or do we want substances that can catalyze profound transformation but require courage and support to navigate? Both have value. The question is, what gets prioritized, what gets funded, what gets approved and prescribed? The other frontier in psilocybin research is combination therapies. Psilocybin plus MDMA for complex PTSD. Psilocybin plus ketamine for treatment-resistant depression. Psilocybin integrated with virtual reality for exposure therapy. The idea is that different substances might complement each other, that combining approaches might produce better outcomes than any single approach alone. Some of this research is promising. MDMA's empathogenic effects combined with psilocybin's ego-dissolving effects might help people process trauma more effectively. Ketamine's rapid antidepressant action might help stabilize people before and after psilocybin sessions. Virtual reality might help people confront fears or practice new behaviors in safe, controlled environments. But combination therapies also multiply complexity. More substances mean more potential interactions, more variables to control, more ways for things to go wrong. The research here is genuinely exploratory. We don't yet know what combinations are safe, effective, or superior to single-substance approaches. The next decade of research will hopefully provide answers, but for now we're in territory that requires caution and careful study. Meanwhile, the cultural conversation around psychedelics continues to evolve. What was fringe a decade ago is becoming mainstream. Public figures are discussing their psychedelic experiences openly. Mainstream media is covering psychedelic research with seriousness rather than sensationalism. The stigma is lifting slowly, unevenly, but noticeably. This cultural shift creates opportunities but also risks. When psychedelics become trendy, when they're marketed as wellness products, when they're divorced from the traditions and frameworks that governed their use historically, things can go wrong. Casual use increases. Inappropriate use increases. People approach powerful substances with insufficient respect and preparation. The pendulum can swing from excessive restriction to excessive permissiveness, both of which cause harm. The goal, presumably, is to find some middle ground. Substances like psilocybin available to those who can benefit, with appropriate safeguards and education, within frameworks that honour traditional knowledge while incorporating modern understanding, accessible but not trivial, legal but not unregulated, respected but not fetishized. Threading this needle requires wisdom, restraint, and ongoing adjustment, as we learn more about how these substances work and how they can be integrated responsibly into modern culture. And then there's the question of what happens when psilocybin becomes truly mainstream, when it's not counterculture, not alternative medicine, not fringe practice, but just another therapeutic option your doctor might suggest. Does that normalization strip away the mystique, the sense of engaging with something profound and mysterious? Or does it simply make powerful tools more accessible to people who need them? The history of other substances suggests both happen. Cannabis, as it's been legalized and commercialized, has lost some of its countercultural cash. It's become a product, marketed and branded and sold like anything else. Some people mourn this loss of identity, this transformation from prohibited plant to commercial commodity. Others celebrate the increased access, the reduced criminalization, the recognition that cannabis has legitimate medical uses. Psilocybin will likely follow a similar trajectory. As it becomes legal and accessible, some of the mystique will fade. It will become less special, less transgressive, less tied to counterculture identity. The underground culture that preserved psychedelic knowledge during Prohibition will either integrate into mainstream frameworks or persist as an alternative for people who want different approaches. But psilocybin has something cannabis doesn't. The experiences it produces are so profoundly unusual, so far outside ordinary consciousness, that they resist trivialization. You can casually smoke cannabis. You can't casually dissolve your ego. Even if psilocybin becomes mainstream, even if it's prescribed by doctors and covered by insurance, the actual experience of taking it will remain extraordinary. That's not something that can be normalized away. The phenomenology of psilocybin experiences, the actual subjective content of what people experience, is remarkably consistent across cultures and contexts. People describe geometric patterns, fractals, intense colors. They describe encounters with entities, beings, intelligences that seem separate from their own consciousness. They describe feelings of unity, of connection to everything, of boundaries dissolving between self and world. They describe insights about their lives, about relationships, about the nature of consciousness itself. Whether these experiences represent genuine contact with something external or are elaborate constructions of the brain under the influence of psilocybin remains an open question. The entities people encounter, are they real in some sense? Or are they projections, personifications of psychological content given form by a brain trying to make sense of novel neural states? The materialist explanation is straightforward. Psilocybin disrupts normal brain activity. The brain tries to construct coherent experience from disrupted input. In doing so, it generates hallucinations, projections, dreamlike narratives that feel real but have no external referent. The entities are no more real than characters in a dream. The insights are just thoughts that feel profound because they are occurring in an altered state. The non-materialist explanation suggests that consciousness might not be entirely generated by the brain, that psilocybin might temporarily alter consciousness in ways that allow access to dimensions or entities that exist independently, that the consistent reports across cultures of similar entities and experiences suggest something more than random hallucination. There's no way to definitively resolve this question. The experiences are real to the people having them. The effects are measurable in terms of change brain activity and therapeutic outcomes. Whether the subjective content corresponds to any external reality is a question that science can't currently answer and might never be able to answer. What matters practically is that people find these experiences meaningful and that they produce lasting psychological benefits. Whether the meaning is discovered or constructed, whether the insights are objective truths or useful fictions, the outcomes are the same. People feel better, they function better, they report increased well-being and life satisfaction. The therapeutic value doesn't depend on resolving metaphysical questions about the nature of consciousness. But the philosophical implications of psilocybin remain fascinating. If a molecule can temporarily reorganize consciousness in ways that dissolve the sense of self, what does that tell us about the self? If ego dissolution produces lasting changes in personality and behavior, what does that say about the permanence of identity? If people can experience themselves as fundamentally connected to everything while on psilocybin, what does that reveal about the constructed nature of separation and individuality? These aren't just abstract philosophical questions. They have practical implications for how we understand mental health, for how we approach therapy, for how we conceptualize human flourishing. If the boundaries of self are fluid rather than fixed, if consciousness is more malleable than we assumed, if our sense of separation from the world is a construct rather than a fundamental truth, then entire frameworks of psychology and psychiatry need to be reconsidered. The Western model of self is deeply individualistic. We think of ourselves as discrete, bounded entities. My thoughts, my feelings, my experiences, all contained within the boundary of my body and my consciousness. Psychotherapy in this model is about strengthening the ego, reinforcing boundaries, helping the individual become more integrated and functional. Psilocybin challenges this model. The dissolution of ego boundaries isn't pathology. For many people, it's healing. The sense of unity with everything isn't psychotic delusion. It's an experience that produces lasting improvements in well-being. Maybe the Western emphasis on strong ego boundaries, on independence and separation, creates psychological problems that only become visible when we temporarily dissolve those boundaries and experience consciousness differently. Indigenous cultures that use psilocybin traditionally had different models of self, more permeable boundaries, more emphasis on connection, on relationship, on understanding oneself as part of a larger whole, rather than as an isolated individual. Their frameworks for mental health, for healing, for human flourishing, were built around these different understandings of consciousness and self. We're now rediscovering that these frameworks might be more accurate, more useful, more conducive to human well-being than the hyper-individualistic model that dominates Western psychology. Not that Western approaches are wrong, but that they're incomplete. That focusing exclusively on strengthening individual ego boundaries while ignoring the human need for connection, for transcendence, for experiences of unity, leaves people psychologically impoverished. Psilocybin offers a way to temporarily step outside the Western model of self and experience consciousness differently. And for many people, that temporary stepping outside provides perspective, provides relief from the constriction of excessive individualism, provides access to ways of being that are more connected, more fluid, more open. This doesn't mean everyone should dissolve their ego. Strong boundaries serve important functions. But the pendulum has swung so far toward individualism, toward separation, toward strengthening ego at all costs, that many people are suffering from disconnection, from isolation, from the loss of meaning that comes when you understand yourself as fundamentally separate from everything else. Psilocybin is a tool for rebalancing. For people who are too rigid, too bounded, too separated, it offers temporary dissolution and the possibility of rebuilding with more flexibility. The therapeutic outcomes we're seeing in clinical trials might not just be about neuroplasticity or serotonin receptors. They might be about providing people with experiences that challenge and expand their understanding of who they are and how they relate to the world. Which brings us back to the beginning. A fungus evolved a compound to stop insects from eating it. Humans discovered that compound and spent thousands of years trying to understand what it does and what it means. We built religions around it. We developed healing practices. We criminalized it. We're now reintegrating it. And throughout all of this, the fundamental mystery remains. What is consciousness? What is the self? Why does a molecule that evolved for fungal defense produce experiences that humans find meaningful, transformative, therapeutic? We have mechanisms, we have correlations, we have therapeutic protocols, but we don't have answers to the deep questions. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe substances that dissolve ego and challenge our assumptions about reality should resist easy explanation. Maybe the mystery is part of what makes them valuable. One phenomenon that emerged in the past decade is microdosing, the practice of taking subperceptual doses of psilocybin regularly rather than taking full psychedelic doses occasionally. The idea is that small amounts, typically 0.1 to 0.3 grams of dried mushrooms taken every few days, can provide benefits without producing hallucinations or ego dissolution, enhance creativity, improved mood, better focus, reduced anxiety, all supposedly achievable without actually tripping. The microdosing trend started in Silicon Valley, promoted by tech workers looking for competitive advantages. Then it spread to other professional environments, to students, to people looking for alternatives to conventional antidepressants. The anecdotal reports were compelling. People claimed microdosing transformed their productivity, their emotional regulation, their quality of life, and crucially, they could microdose while maintaining normal functioning, going to work, managing responsibilities, living ordinary lives. The scientific evidence for microdosing, however, is mixed. Several studies have found no difference between microdosing psilocybin and placebo. People who thought they were microdosing reported benefits, but so did people who thought they were microdosing but were actually taking placebo, which suggests that the benefits might be largely expectation and placebo effect rather than pharmacological action. Other studies have found modest effects on mood and cognition, but nothing dramatic. And the problem with microdosing research is that it's nearly impossible to conduct truly blinded studies. People can generally tell when they've taken psilocybin, even at low doses. Slight changes in perception, mild mood elevation, subtle shifts in cognition, these give it away. Which means placebo-controlled studies are compromised because participants know whether they're in the treatment or control group. The other issue is that we don't know the long-term effects of regular low-dose psilocybin use. The traditional ceremonial use was occasional, maybe a few times a year. Clinical trials involve 1 or 2 high-dose sessions. Microdosing is daily or every few days use for months or years. We have no data on what that does over time. It might be completely safe. It might cause subtle issues that only become apparent after years of use. We don't know. The cardiovascular concerns are real. Psilocybin acts on serotonin receptors, including 5-HT2B receptors in heart valves. Chronic activation of these receptors can cause valvular heart disease. LSD, which also acts on 5-HT2B receptors, was associated with heart valve problems when used as an appetite suppressant in the 1990s. That was at higher doses than microdosing, but the principle is concerning. Regular psilocybin use might pose cardiac risks that occasional use doesn't. Until we have long-term safety data, microdosing remains experimental. People do it anyway, convinced by anecdotal reports and willing to accept unknown risks for perceived benefits, which is their choice. But it's a choice being made without adequate information, and that's concerning from a public health perspective. The microdosing phenomenon also represents a shift in how people think about psychedelics. Traditional use was about profound experiences, about transformation, about occasional journeys into altered consciousness. Microdosing is about optimization, about incremental improvements in performance and mood, about integrating psychedelics into daily life as a productivity tool. It's psychedelics as nootropic rather than psychedelics as sacrament. This optimization mindset fits perfectly with contemporary culture's obsession with enhancement, with being more productive, more creative, more emotionally regulated. But it might miss what's actually valuable about psychedelics. The profound experiences, the ego dissolution, the confrontation with aspects of self that are normally hidden, these are uncomfortable and inconvenient. They're not compatible with maintaining normal productivity. But they might be where the real therapeutic and transformative potential lies. Microdosing offers benefits without discomfort, enhancement without confrontation, optimization without transformation, which makes it appealing. But it might also be psychedelics defanged, their radical potential domesticated, their challenging aspects removed to make them palatable to people who want improvement without disruption. Then again, maybe that's also elitist. Maybe not everyone needs or wants profound transformation. Maybe some people just want to feel a bit better, to be a bit more creative, to manage their mood more effectively. And if microdosing helps with that, even if it's partly placebo, maybe that's valuable. Not everyone's seeking enlightenment. Some people just want incremental improvement. The question is whether we're being honest about what microdosing is and isn't, whether the hype matches the evidence, whether people understand the known unknowns before they commit to regular use. Without long-term studies, without clear safety data, without honest acknowledgement of what we don't know, people are essentially conducting uncontrolled experiments on themselves. The other major recent development is the emergence of psychedelic retreats, particularly in countries where psilocybin is legal or decriminalized. Jamaica, Mexico, Netherlands, Costa Rica. These have become destinations for psychedelic tourism. People fly in, spend a week at a retreat center, have guided psilocybin experiences, and fly home. It's expensive, often several $1,000s, but it provides legal access in comfortable settings with professional facilitation. The quality of these retreats varies enormously. Some are run by experienced facilitators with backgrounds in therapy, with appropriate medical screening, with careful attention to set and setting. Others are essentially luxury spas that happen to include psychedelics, more focused on amenities than on therapeutic rigor, and some are outright exploitative, charging exorbitant prices while providing minimal support and inadequate safety protocols. The retreat model has advantages. People can access psilocybin legally. They can do so in beautiful settings specifically designed for psychedelic experiences. They have facilitators present throughout. They're removed from their normal environment, which can help them engage more fully with the experience. For people with resources, retreats can provide meaningful, potentially therapeutic experiences. But the retreat model also has significant problems. It's exclusive by price. Most people can't afford to spend thousands of dollars on a week-long retreat. The separation from normal life, while helpful for engagement, also makes integration more difficult. You have a profound experience in paradise, then return to your regular life with all its stresses and challenges. That transition can be jarring, and the insights gained at the retreat can be difficult to apply to ordinary circumstances. Without ongoing support, without community, without integration practices built into daily life, retreat experiences can feel more like temporary escapes than lasting transformations. And there's something unsettling about psychedelic experiences being packaged as luxury goods. Psilocybin has been used for thousands of years in contexts that were anything but luxurious. Simple dwellings, minimal comfort, focus on the experience rather than the amenities. Retreats that emphasize gourmet meals, spa treatments, picturesque locations, these feel like they're missing the point. The mushrooms don't care about the thread count of your sheets. But maybe that's also elitist. Maybe making psychedelic experiences comfortable and safe makes them more accessible to people who would be intimidated by more austere contexts. Maybe the luxury setting helps people relax, reduces anxiety, creates psychological safety. There's no one right way to approach psychedelics. Different people need different contexts. The question is whether retreats are serving genuine therapeutic needs or just catering to wealthy consumers looking for novel experiences. The international legal landscape for psychedelics continues to shift. Jamaica has become a popular destination because psilocybin mushrooms were never explicitly criminalized there. They're in legal limbo, not legal but not illegal, which has allowed a retreat industry to flourish. Mexico has a complex relationship with psychedelics, with traditional indigenous use technically protected but commercial use existing in grey areas. The Netherlands allows psilocybin mushrooms in the form of truffles, which are technically a different part of the fungus but contain the same active compounds. This legal distinction allows for a thriving smart shop industry where people can buy psilocybin truffles legally. Amsterdam has become a destination for psychedelic experiences with guided sessions, retreat centres, and relatively easy access. Portugal's drug decriminalisation model extends to psilocybin, meaning possession for personal use doesn't result in criminal charges. This has made Portugal attractive for people seeking access without fear of prosecution. Though it's worth noting that decriminalisation isn't legalisation. You won't be arrested, but you also can't buy mushrooms openly. You still need to cultivate them or find underground sources. In the United States, the patchwork of state and local policies creates a confusing landscape. Denver, Oakland, Santa Cruz, Washington, D.C., Ann Arbor, Seattle, these cities have decriminalized psilocybin. Oregon has created its licensed facilitator system. Some states are considering similar measures, others maintain strict prohibition, and federal law still classifies psilocybin as Schedule 1, creating conflicts between federal and state policies that remain unresolved. Canada has taken a middle approach, allowing access to psilocybin for end-of-life care in certain circumstances, approving it for clinical trials, but not broadly legalizing it. This provides some access while maintaining regulatory control. It's cautious, incremental, focused on medical applications rather than broader legalization. The global trend is toward loosening restrictions, toward recognizing that psilocybin has legitimate therapeutic uses, toward treating it as a public health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. But the pace is slow, the approaches are varied, and the outcomes remain uncertain. We're in a transitional period where old policies are breaking down, but New frameworks aren't yet established, and the tension between medical and traditional use continues. Some indigenous groups in Mexico and other countries are pushing back against psychedelic tourism, arguing that their sacred medicines are being exploited, that foreigners are coming in, participating in ceremonies without understanding or respecting the cultural context, reducing sacred practices to tourist experiences. These concerns are valid. There's a real difference between participating in a traditional ceremony led by an indigenous healer within a cultural framework and taking mushrooms at a retreat centre run by Western facilitators. The latter might be informed by traditional practices, might incorporate some elements of ceremony, but it's not the same thing. It's an approximation, a translation, something that borrows from tradition without fully embodying it. The question of cultural appropriation in psychedelics is thorny. On one hand, knowledge should be shared. If psilocybin can help people, restricting access based on cultural origin seems wrong. On the other hand, indigenous communities have preserved this knowledge through centuries of persecution. They've maintained traditions, developed frameworks for safe use, created cultural contexts that make these experiences meaningful. When that knowledge gets extracted, commercialized, divorced from its cultural origins, something valuable is lost. There's no easy resolution. Respectful engagement with traditional knowledge, fair compensation for indigenous communities, inclusion of indigenous voices in policy decisions, these are starting points. But they don't fully address the underlying tension between making psychedelics accessible and honouring their cultural origins. The path forward probably requires multiple tracks. Medical frameworks for people seeking therapeutic treatment, traditional ceremonial contexts for people seeking spiritual experiences, community-based approaches for people who want peer support rather than institutional medicine, personal use for people who want autonomy and privacy. Each of these serves different needs, embodies different values, creates different outcomes. The challenge is creating legal and cultural frameworks that accommodate this diversity, rather than forcing psychedelics into narrow categories. Medicine isn't the only legitimate use. Recreation isn't necessarily illegitimate. Spiritual practice deserves recognition. Personal exploration has value. All of these can coexist if we're willing to accept complexity rather than demanding simplicity. And underlying all of this is the basic reality. The mushrooms exist. They produce psilocybin. People will continue to find them, grow them, use them. No amount of prohibition, no restrictive policy, no legal framework can eliminate that. The only question is whether we create conditions for safe, beneficial use or drive use underground, where it's less safe, less supported, more likely to cause harm. The last few years have seen an explosion of popular interest in psychedelics. Books, documentaries, podcasts, mainstream media coverage, all treating psychedelics seriously rather than sensationally. Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind brought psychedelic science to a broad audience, explaining the research with nuance and rigour. Netflix documentaries have explored psychedelic therapy, traditional use, the history of prohibition. Joe Rogan and other popular podcasters regularly discuss their psychedelic experiences, normalising these substances in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. This mainstreaming creates opportunities but also risks. When psychedelics become trendy, when celebrities discuss them, when they're marketed as wellness products, casual use increases. People try them without adequate preparation, without understanding the risks, without respecting the substances. And when things go wrong, when someone has a bad experience or triggers latent psychological issues, the backlash can be intense. The media cycle around psychedelics tends toward extremes. Either they're miracle cures that will revolutionize mental health, or they're dangerous drugs that cause psychosis and harm. The nuanced reality that they're powerful tools with both potential benefits and potential risks that depend entirely on context doesn't make for compelling headlines, so we get hype and backlash, optimism and fear, with less attention to the complex middle ground where the truth lives. The scientific community is trying to maintain rigour in the face of growing public enthusiasm. Researchers emphasise that results are preliminary, that larger studies are needed, that psilocybin isn't appropriate for everyone. They push back against oversimplified narratives while still advocating for continued research and eventual therapeutic use. It's a difficult balance. Too cautious, and you risk losing momentum and funding. too enthusiastic, and you risk overpromising and inviting regulatory backlash. The pharmaceutical industry's increasing involvement adds another layer of complexity. On one hand, pharmaceutical companies bring resources, expertise in navigating FDA approval processes, infrastructure for manufacturing and distribution. On the other hand, they prioritize profit, they patent knowledge that should be shared freely, they focus on medical applications while ignoring other legitimate uses. Some companies are taking ethical approaches, committing to affordable access, partnering with indigenous communities, supporting research into non-medical applications. Others are pursuing aggressive patent strategies, trying to monopolize markets, focusing exclusively on profitable medical conditions while ignoring broader therapeutic potential. The industry isn't monolithic. Different companies have different values, different priorities, different visions for what the psychedelic renaissance should look like. And then there's the question of what psychedelics can't do. They're not panaceas. They won't solve all mental health problems. They won't replace the need for systemic changes to address poverty, inequality, trauma. They won't fix broken healthcare systems or oppressive social structures. They're tools, not solutions. Powerful tools, potentially transformative tools, but just tools. The risk of overhyping psychedelics is that we set unrealistic expectations, that people expect miracles and are disappointed when they get something more modest. A significant percentage of people don't respond to psilocybin therapy. Some people have difficult experiences that aren't ultimately therapeutic. The outcomes, while impressive on average, are variable at the individual level. Managing expectations while maintaining enthusiasm, acknowledging limitations while advocating for access, this is the challenge facing the psychedelic community. Too much skepticism and the Renaissance stalls. Too much enthusiasm and the backlash when reality doesn't match the hype could set everything back. The truth is that psychedelics work well for some people in some contexts for some conditions. That's valuable but not revolutionary. That's meaningful but not miraculous. The integration of psychedelics into mainstream culture and medicine will be messy, uneven, fraught with complications and contradictions. It won't be a smooth transition from prohibition to widespread therapeutic use. It will be contested every step of the way by people with different interests, different values, different visions for what appropriate use looks like. And indigenous communities will be watching, judging whether Western culture has learned from its history of extraction and exploitation, or whether we're repeating the same patterns with new rhetoric. Whether we honor the origins of psychedelic knowledge or simply take what we want and move on. Whether we create systems that benefit everyone or systems that benefit primarily those with resources and power. The mushrooms, through all of this, will remain indifferent. They're not trying to save humanity, or transform consciousness, or revolutionize mental health. They're just fungi, producing compounds that happen to affect mammalian brains in profound ways. The meaning, the significance, the therapeutic potential, all of that is something humans have constructed around them. The mushrooms just keep growing, keep producing psilocybin, keep being available to anyone who seeks them out, which is maybe the most important lesson. These substances don't have inherent meaning. We give them meaning through how we use them, the frameworks we build around them, the intentions we bring to them. The same molecule can be medicine, sacrament, recreation, catalyst for transformation, or just another way to get high. Context determines everything. Chemistry provides possibility. Culture determines outcome. The history of magic mushrooms is really the history of humans trying to figure out what to do with something powerful and strange. We've tried prohibition, which didn't work. We're now trying integration, which is messy and complicated. Maybe in another decade, we'll have frameworks that actually work, that honor tradition while serving modern needs, that make these substances accessible without trivializing them. Or maybe we'll still be muddling through, trying to balance competing values and interests, never quite getting it right. But the fundamental reality won't change. Some fungi produce psilocybin. Some humans consume those fungi and have experiences that change them. That's been true for thousands of years. It will probably be true for thousands more. The details of how we organize society around that reality will shift. The mushrooms will remain constant, growing in the dark, producing their compound, waiting for the next person to discover them and wonder what it all means. So where does all this leave us? With a fungus that evolved a defense mechanism against insects, and accidentally gave humans a tool for temporarily dissolving the boundaries of consciousness. With thousands of years of ceremonial use, 50 years of prohibition, and a modern renaissance that's equal parts scientific validation and commercial exploitation. With clinical trials showing remarkable therapeutic potential, and cultural conversations about appropriation, access, and what these substances actually mean. The magic mushroom didn't ask for any of this. It just wanted bugs to stop eating it. Instead, it got religions built around it, criminalization, pharmaceutical patents, luxury retreats, and hundreds of research papers trying to explain what it does to human brains. Call it the most consequential accident in the history of fungal evolution. What we know now, with decades of renewed research and thousands of years of traditional knowledge to draw from, is that psilocybin is a tool, a powerful tool, a tool that can help people with depression, PTSD, addiction, existential anxiety, a tool that can produce profound mystical experiences that people rate as among the most meaningful of their lives, a tool that can temporarily dissolve ego boundaries and create space for psychological transformation. But still just a tool, not a cure, not a miracle, not a solution to all of humanity's problems, just a tool that works remarkably well for some people, in some contexts for some purposes. The challenge now is figuring out how to integrate this tool into modern society in ways that honour its history, respect its power, and make it accessible to people who can benefit from it. That means navigating tensions between medical and traditional use, between commercialization and accessibility, between individual autonomy and public health concerns. It means acknowledging that different people need different frameworks, that there's no one right way to approach psilocybin, that both clinical therapy and ceremonial use have value. It also means being honest about what we don't know. We don't know the long-term effects of regular microdosing. We don't fully understand why psilocybin produces the specific experiences it does. We don't know how to predict who will benefit and who won't. We don't know the optimal therapeutic protocols, the ideal dosing, the best approaches to preparation and integration. We're learning, but we're far from having complete understanding, and it means confronting uncomfortable questions about equity and appropriation. Who profits from the psychedelic renaissance? Who benefits from increased access? Whose knowledge is being used, and who receives recognition and compensation? Are we building systems that serve everyone, or systems that primarily benefit people with resources and privilege? These aren't abstract questions. They're pragmatic concerns that will determine whether the integration of psilocybin into mainstream culture is ethical or just another form of extraction. The indigenous communities who preserved mushroom knowledge through centuries of suppression deserve more than acknowledgement. They deserve partnership, compensation, decision-making power. The traditions they maintained aren't just interesting historical footnotes. They're frameworks for safe, meaningful use that took thousands of years to develop. When we borrow from those traditions, when we translate ceremonial practices into clinical protocols, when we commodify knowledge that was shared freely, we have obligations. Whether we meet those obligations remains to be seen. The pharmaceutical industry's involvement is inevitable but concerning. Companies will patent psilocybin formulations, develop proprietary protocols, create exclusive markets. Some will do so ethically, prioritizing access and affordability. Others will maximize profit at the expense of equity. The FDA approval process, while necessary for medical legitimacy, also creates bottlenecks and gives gatekeeping power to institutions that don't necessarily prioritize public good over private profit. Meanwhile, decriminalization efforts are creating alternative pathways. People can grow their own mushrooms without fear of prosecution. Community-based healing circles can operate openly. Personal use becomes a matter of individual choice rather than criminal justice. These grassroots approaches won't replace medical frameworks, but they provide options for people who want autonomy, who don't trust institutional medicine, or who can't afford clinical therapy. The likely future is multiple parallel systems. Medical psilocybin for people seeking conventional healthcare, licensed facilitators for people who want guided experiences outside medical contexts, traditional ceremonies for people seeking spiritual frameworks, personal cultivation, and use for people who want privacy and autonomy, underground networks for people in jurisdictions that maintain prohibition. All of these coexisting, serving different populations, embodying different values, This pluralism is messy but probably necessary. Psilocybin doesn't fit neatly into existing categories. It's not quite medicine, not quite recreation, not quite spiritual practice. It's all of these depending on context and intention. Trying to force it into a single regulatory framework would be like trying to force wine into either medicine or poison categories. It's both, neither, and something else depending on how you use it. The question is whether legal and cultural frameworks can accommodate this complexity, or whether they'll try to simplify it in ways that do violence to the reality of what psilocybin is and how people actually use it. Early signs are mixed. Some jurisdictions are taking nuanced approaches, others are defaulting to prohibition or medical monopolies. The next decade will determine which models succeed and which fail. What's certain is that psilocybin isn't going away. The research is too compelling. The therapeutic potential is too significant. Public opinion has shifted too dramatically. The knowledge is too widely distributed. The mushrooms are too easy to grow. We're past the point where prohibition is sustainable. The only question is what comes next. And maybe that's fitting. A substance that dissolves boundaries, that challenges fixed categories, that resists easy explanation, shouldn't fit neatly into our existing systems. Maybe the discomfort of trying to integrate psilocybin into modern culture is the point. Maybe it's forcing us to question assumptions, to acknowledge complexity, to build frameworks that are flexible enough to accommodate things that don't fit standard categories. The mushrooms have been doing this for thousands of years, challenging assumptions, dissolving boundaries, forcing humans to grapple with questions about consciousness, self, and reality that don't have simple answers. Every culture that encountered psilocybin had to figure out what to do with something that powerful and strange. We're just the latest in a long line of humans trying to make sense of fungi that temporarily rewire consciousness. Maybe we'll do better than previous generations. Maybe we'll create frameworks that actually work, that honour tradition while serving modern needs, that make psilocybin accessible without trivializing it. Maybe we'll learn from the mistakes of prohibition, from the failures of the war on drugs, from the cultural destruction of indigenous knowledge. Maybe we'll build something better, or maybe we'll just muddle through, making the same mistakes in slightly different forms, extracting knowledge without giving back, commercializing without considering consequences, prioritizing profit over people. History suggests humans are better at repetition than innovation, better at recreating old problems than solving them. But the mushrooms don't care. They'll keep growing in pastures and forests. They'll keep producing psilocybin as an insect deterrent. They'll keep being available to humans who seek them out. And some of those humans will eat them and have experiences that change them. That's been true for millennia. It will probably be true for millennia more. The meaning of those experiences, the frameworks we build around them, the uses we put them to, the systems we create for access and regulation, all of that is up to us. The chemistry is neutral. The mushrooms are indifferent. What we make of them reflects our values, our priorities, our understanding of consciousness and healing and human flourishing. So here we are. Stone Age cave paintings depicting possible mushroom use. Aztec Teonanacatl, Flesh of the Gods. Maria Sabina's Veladas in Darkness, guided by prayer and song. R. Gordon Wasson's 1957 Life magazine article. Timothy Leary's Turn On, Tune In, Dropout. The War on Drugs. Decades of Prohibition. Underground cultivation networks keeping knowledge alive. Roland Griffith's Restarting Clinical Research. FDA Breakthrough Therapy Designation. Oregon's Licensed Facilitators. Decriminalization spreading city by city. And mushrooms, still growing in cow pastures, still producing psilocybin, still waiting for the next person to discover them. The history of magic mushrooms is the history of humans encountering something that challenges fundamental assumptions about who we are and how consciousness works. It's the history of trying to control something that resists control, trying to understand something that resists simple explanation, trying to integrate something that fundamentally doesn't fit our categories. And maybe that's the lesson. Not that we need to understand psilocybin completely, not that we need to control it perfectly, not that we need to fit it into existing frameworks. Maybe we just need to approach it with humility, with respect for what we don't know, with acknowledgement that some things are more complex than our systems can accommodate. The mushrooms will keep doing what they've always done, growing, producing psilocybin, affecting the brains of mammals who eat them. The rest, how we make sense of that, what frameworks we build, what systems we create, that's all on us, and we're still figuring it out, probably always will be. Because here's the thing about substances that dissolve ego and challenge your sense of reality. They don't provide answers, they provide questions. Better questions, hopefully. More honest questions. Questions that get at what actually matters rather than what's comfortable to think about. Psilocybin strips away the narratives we use to make sense of ourselves and the world, and for a few hours we have to confront what's underneath those narratives. Sometimes what's underneath is beautiful. Sometimes it's terrifying. Usually it's both. The therapeutic outcomes we're seeing in clinical trials, the lasting improvements in depression and anxiety and addiction, those don't come from the psilocybin directly. They come from what people do with the experience, the insights they gain, the perspectives they develop, the changes they make afterward. The mushroom opens the door. You have to walk through it. And that requires work, courage, willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself and your life. This is why set and setting matter so much. This is why preparation and integration are essential. This is why traditional ceremonies included prayers and songs and skilled guides. The experience needs a container, a framework, support for the difficult parts and guidance for making sense of it afterward. Without that, you're just having an intense altered state with no way to translate it into meaningful change. Western culture initially got this wrong. We thought the chemical was the treatment, that you could just take psilocybin and it would fix you. Clinical research is rediscovering what indigenous traditions always knew. The chemical is the catalyst. The healing comes from the work you do with what the catalyst reveals. Psilocybin creates possibility. You have to actualize that possibility through intention, through integration, through applying insights to your actual life. And this is where the medicalization of psilocybin gets tricky. Medicine wants protocols, standardization, predictable outcomes. But psilocybin experiences are inherently unpredictable, deeply personal, resistant to standardization. Two people can take the same dose in the same setting and have completely different experiences. The same person can have different experiences on different occasions. You can't control it the way you can control a surgical procedure or a pharmaceutical that produces predictable effects. This unpredictability is part of what makes psilocybin valuable. It takes you somewhere you couldn't go through will alone. It shows you things you weren't looking for. It disrupts your assumptions in ways you couldn't have anticipated. The lack of control is the point. If you could control the experience, if you could predetermine what insights you'd gain, it wouldn't work. The therapeutic value comes from being surprised, from encountering aspects of yourself you've been avoiding, from having your certainties dissolved. But this creates problems for medical frameworks that emphasize control, predictability, informed consent. How do you get informed consent for an experience you can't fully describe in advance? How do you standardize a protocol when the content of the experience varies so dramatically between individuals? How do you manage risk when the primary risks are psychological and depend on individual vulnerabilities you can't always detect through screening? These aren't insurmountable problems. The clinical protocols being developed are sophisticated attempts to manage unpredictability while creating conditions for safe, beneficial experiences. But they're problems that highlight the tension between psychedelic experiences and medical models. Maybe psilocybin therapy will always be somewhat outside conventional medicine, somewhat resistant to full medicalization, somewhat mysterious. And maybe that's appropriate. Consciousness is mysterious. The self is mysterious. The fact that a fungal compound can temporarily reorganize consciousness in ways that produce lasting psychological benefits is mysterious. Science can describe mechanisms, can identify receptors and neural networks, can correlate brain changes with subjective experiences. But the deeper question of why this works, why temporary ego dissolution produces lasting improvements in well-being, why experiences that seem hallucinatory and unreal, while they're happening, somehow reveal important truths, these questions remain unanswered. Indigenous traditions didn't need answers to these questions. They observed that mushrooms worked, developed frameworks for safe use, and integrated them into healing and spiritual practices. The mystery was accepted, even honored. The mushrooms were treated as teachers, as beings with intelligence and intention. Whether that's literally true or metaphorically useful is almost beside the point. The framework worked. People were helped. Western science wants different kinds of answers. We want mechanisms, we want causality, we want explanation that fits our models of how brains and minds work, and we're getting some of that. Neuroplasticity, 5-HT2A receptor activation, default mode network disruption. These are real mechanisms that help explain what psilocybin does. But they don't fully explain why it works therapeutically, why the experiences feel meaningful, why people describe encounters with something that seems more real than ordinary reality. Maybe both approaches have value. Scientific understanding of mechanisms can improve safety and efficacy. Traditional understanding of ceremony and integration can provide frameworks that honour the depth and complexity of these experiences. The synthesis of scientific rigour and traditional wisdom might produce better outcomes than either approach alone. Or maybe we're overcomplicating it. Maybe the mushrooms just work, have always worked, will continue to work regardless of whether we fully understand why. Maybe the important thing isn't explanation but application, isn't comprehension but compassionate use. Maybe we don't need to solve the mystery to benefit from it. The arc of psychedelic history suggests cycles: discovery, integration into cultural practices, eventual prohibition or restriction, underground preservation of knowledge, rediscovery. We're in a rediscovery phase now. Clinical research validating what traditional use demonstrated. Legal frameworks slowly catching up with scientific evidence. Cultural attitudes shifting from fear to curiosity to acceptance. Whether this cycle leads somewhere different, whether we build sustainable frameworks that avoid future prohibition, whether we learn from past mistakes, remains to be seen. The early signs are encouraging but far from guaranteed. Public opinion supports psychedelic research and therapeutic use. But public opinion can shift. Political winds change. One high-profile tragedy, one media panic, one moral entrepreneur with political power, and we could see backlash that undoes progress. The durability of the psychedelic renaissance depends on maintaining scientific rigour, avoiding overhype, managing risks responsibly, and building broad coalitions that include diverse stakeholders. It depends on indigenous communities being genuine partners rather than just sources of knowledge to extract. It depends on prioritising access over profit, equity over exclusivity. These are ambitious goals. Whether we achieve them depends on choices we make collectively over the coming years. But regardless of what systems humans build, the mushrooms will remain. Psilocybe cubensis will keep growing in pastures where cattle graze. Psilocybe semilanceata will keep fruiting in autumn meadows. Psilocybe azurescens will keep colonising coastal dune grass. The chemistry of psilocybin will remain unchanged. The effects on consciousness will remain profound. And some humans will continue to find these mushrooms, consume them, and have experiences that change them. That's the baseline reality. Everything else, all the research and policy and cultural conversation, is humans trying to figure out what to do with that reality. And we're doing the best we can, which sometimes isn't great, but which is better than the alternative of pretending these substances don't exist, or that prohibition can somehow eliminate them. So we arrive where we began. With a lump of fungus growing in cow shit, dissolving egos, and somehow convincing humans it was a direct telephone line to God. Except now, we have MRI scans of what happens to the brain, clinical trials demonstrating therapeutic efficacy, detailed understanding of receptor binding and neurotransmitter systems. We know more than we ever have. We still don't know enough. The magic mushroom remains exactly what it always was. A fungus that evolved psilocybin to deter insects. The magic, the sacredness, the therapeutic potential, the profound experiences, all of that is something humans brought to it. The mushroom is just being a mushroom, following its evolutionary programming, producing compounds it needs to survive. But humans aren't just being humans. We're trying to survive too, in a world that often feels designed to crush us. We're dealing with depression, anxiety, trauma, addiction, existential despair. We're looking for meaning, for connection, for ways to make sense of existence that sometimes seems purposeless and painful. And for reasons we don't fully understand, a mushroom that never asked to be magic can sometimes help with that. Not always, not for everyone, but often enough, reliably enough, that it's worth paying attention. Whether we build systems worthy of that potential, whether we honour the knowledge that brought us here, whether, We create access that's genuinely equitable. Whether we approach these powerful tools with the humility and respect they deserve, that's on us. The mushrooms will be fine either way. It's humans who need to figure this out. And the clock's ticking. The story doesn't end. It never really does. Stories about consciousness, about substances that alter it, about humans trying to understand themselves, these stories don't have clean conclusions. They just keep going, evolving, complicating, refusing to resolve. Right now, somewhere, someone is having their first psilocybin experience. Maybe in a clinical trial, lying on a comfortable couch with eye shades and carefully curated music, 2 trained therapists sitting nearby. Maybe at a retreat centre in Jamaica, surrounded by tropical foliage, guided by facilitators who've done this hundreds of times. Maybe in their bedroom, alone, having grown the mushrooms themselves, following guides they found online, hoping for something meaningful. Maybe in a ceremony led by an indigenous healer, continuing traditions that stretch back thousands of years. The setting varies, the substance doesn't. Psilocybin, doing what it's always done, binding to serotonin receptors, disrupting default mode networks, temporarily reorganizing consciousness in ways that resist prediction. And that person, whoever they are, wherever they are, is encountering something that challenges everything they thought they knew about themselves. Maybe they'll be terrified. Maybe they'll be ecstatic. Maybe they'll confront trauma they've been avoiding for decades. Maybe they'll feel connected to everything that exists. Maybe they'll see geometric patterns that seem more real than ordinary reality. Maybe they'll encounter entities that appear to have intelligence and intention. Maybe they'll just feel weird for a few hours and then return to normal. The experience is unpredictable. The potential is real. And somewhere else, a researcher is analysing data from the latest clinical trial. A pharmaceutical company is filing patents. A city council is debating decriminalisation. An indigenous community is watching Western culture commodify their sacred medicine. A farmer is noticing mushrooms fruiting in their cattle pasture. A policymaker is trying to figure out how to regulate something that doesn't fit existing categories. And the mushrooms keep growing, in pastures, in forests, in closets where people have set up amateur cultivation operations, on decomposing wood, in grassroots. Anywhere there's organic matter and moisture in the right conditions, they keep producing psilocybin, keep waiting for the next mammal to eat them, and have their consciousness temporarily reorganized. This is the reality we're living with. Not a problem to solve, not a question to answer, just an ongoing situation that requires navigation, adjustment, wisdom, and humility. Psilocybin exists. It affects human consciousness profoundly. Some people benefit from that. Others are harmed by inappropriate use. Most institutions aren't designed to accommodate it. Traditional knowledge exists but isn't always accessible or respected. Science is catching up but remains incomplete. We're figuring it out as we go, building frameworks that might work, discarding approaches that clearly don't, learning from mistakes when we can, repeating them when we can't. It's messy, it's complicated, it's fraught with ethical dilemmas and practical challenges, and it's happening whether anyone's comfortable with it or not. The arc bends toward integration, toward legalization, toward medical acceptance, toward cultural normalization. But arcs don't move in straight lines. There will be setbacks. There will be backlashes. There will be tragedies that get exploited for political purposes. There will be overhyping that invites skepticism. There will be commercialization that offends people who think psychedelics should remain sacred. There will be conflicts between different visions for what appropriate use looks like. And through all of it, the mushrooms will remain indifferent. They're not trying to help humanity. They're not trying to transform consciousness. They're not trying to challenge our assumptions about reality. They're just fungi following their evolutionary programming, producing compounds that happen to have profound effects on mammalian brains. The meaning, the significance, the therapeutic potential, the spiritual dimensions, all of that is human construction, which doesn't make it less real. Human constructions matter. The frameworks we build around psychedelics will determine who benefits and who's harmed. The policies we implement will shape access and safety. The cultural conversations we have will influence whether these substances are approached with respect or reduced to commodities. The choices we make collectively will create the reality of what psychedelics become in modern society. Those choices are being made now, in research institutions, in policy meetings, in ceremonies and clinics and retreat centres, in underground communities that maintain knowledge when official channels fail, by indigenous healers defending traditional practices, by pharmaceutical executives calculating profits, by activists pushing for decriminalisation, by people seeking healing, seeking meaning, seeking experiences that might help them understand themselves and the world differently. And at the centre of all this complexity, all this conflict, all this human striving to make sense of something powerful and strange, there's just a mushroom, growing quietly, producing psilocybin, waiting for the next person to discover it and wonder what it all means. That's the story. That's always been the story. Humans encountering fungi that temporarily dissolve consciousness and trying to figure out what to do with that. We've tried worship, we've tried prohibition, we're trying medicine now. None of these approaches are complete. None of them fully capture what psilocybin is or what it does or what it means. Maybe there isn't a complete answer. Maybe it's different things to different people in different contexts. Maybe the multiplicity is the point. Maybe the ongoing struggle to understand, to integrate, to use wisely, maybe that struggle is what matters rather than any final resolution. The mushrooms don't need our understanding. They don't need our frameworks or our policies or our research. They'll be fine. It's humans who need to figure this out. Humans who are struggling with mental health crises, existential despair, disconnection, loss of meaning. Humans who are looking for tools, for healing, for ways to make sense of existence that often feels purposeless. And for some of those humans, for reasons we still don't fully comprehend, a mushroom can help. Not fix, not cure, not provide easy answers, but help, create space for change, disrupt patterns that cause suffering, provide experiences that shift perspective in lasting ways. That's valuable. That's worth the messy work of integration, the uncomfortable confrontations with our assumptions, the difficult process of building frameworks that might actually serve human flourishing, rather than just institutional power or commercial profit. So the work continues, the research continues, the policy debates continue, the ceremonies continue, the underground cultivation continues, the struggles over access and appropriation and commercialization continue, and the mushrooms keep growing, keep producing psilocybin, keep challenging humans to grapple with something that resists simple explanation. Welcome to the ongoing, unfinished, perpetually complicating story of magic mushrooms. It started thousands of years ago. It's not ending anytime soon. And whatever happens next, the mushrooms will be there, growing in the dark, producing their compounds, waiting for humans to figure out what wisdom, if any, we can extract from fungi that never asked to be wise. Because that's the final irony. We're trying to extract wisdom from something that evolved to taste bad to insects. We're building religions, conducting clinical trials, filing patents, having philosophical debates, creating regulatory frameworks, all around a molecule that exists because it made bugs stop eating mushrooms. Evolution doesn't care about human consciousness, or therapeutic outcomes or mystical experiences. It cares about survival and reproduction. The fact that psilocybin happens to profoundly affect human brains is coincidence, accident, a side effect of chemical evolution that had nothing to do with us. But here we are, giving it meaning anyway, creating frameworks, building traditions, developing protocols, trying to understand what it does and why it matters. Because that's what humans do. We encounter things that affect us, and we try to make sense of them, try to fit them into narratives that help us understand ourselves and our place in the world. The magic mushroom will keep being whatever it is, a fungus with a peculiar defensive chemistry, a sacrament, a medicine, a tool, a mystery, a commodity. All of these and none of these depending on who's encountering it and what framework they're bringing to the encounter. The mushroom doesn't change. Our relationship with it does. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we can ask for. Not complete understanding, not perfect systems, not resolution of all the tensions and contradictions. Just ongoing engagement with something powerful and strange, approached with as much wisdom and humility as we can manage, which some days is considerable and some days is barely any at all. The mushrooms will be patient. They've been patient for millions of years of evolution. They can wait while humans figure out what to do with them. Whether we ever truly figure it out, whether we build something worth building, whether we honour the knowledge that brought us here while creating frameworks that serve actual human needs, that remains to be seen. But the potential is there. The tools exist. The knowledge exists. The will exists, at least among some people some of the time. What we make of all that will determine whether the psychedelic renaissance is remembered as a moment when humanity got slightly wiser about consciousness and healing, or just another cycle of discovery, hype, exploitation, and eventual disappointment. Place your bets. The mushrooms already have.